Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth was undergoing a dramatic transformation. The ice sheets of the Pleistocene were retreating, giving way to the warmer, more stable climate of the Holocene epoch. For our ancestors, this new world brought both challenges and unprecedented opportunities. With each melting glacier, with each warming season, the land itself changed, and with it, the lives of those who inhabited it. In this time of change, early humans had to adapt to an environment that was reshaping itself. Animals and plants that had once been central to their diets became less available or disappeared entirely, while new resources emerged, reshaping diets and survival strategies. The landscapes they called home transformed from open tundras to lush forests, from icy plains to verdant river valleys, each new ecosystem requiring its own unique approach to survival. In the warmer, wetter climate of the Holocene, smaller game animals, fish, and plant resources like nuts and tubers became essential components of the human diet. With fewer large game animals like mammoths and reindeer to hunt, early humans turned their attention to these new, diverse sources of nutrition. Rivers and lakes became vital gathering places, where fish and freshwater mollusks provided reliable food sources. These sites became hubs of activity, offering both sustenance and a meeting place for communities. This transition also marked an evolution in the tools and techniques early humans used. New tools were crafted specifically for gathering and processing plant foods. Grinding stones, for example, allowed people to break down tough seeds and grains, creating more versatile diets. Fishing hooks, snares, and traps designed for small animals and fish opened up new opportunities for food gathering. Each tool, each innovation, represented a small step forward in their adaptation to this new environment. The adaptation wasn't just about survival. It was about creating stability in an unpredictable world. These early humans learned to take advantage of specific, resource-rich areas, settling temporarily where the environment provided ample food. As they adapted to the rhythms of seasonal resources, these semi-permanent camps became part of a pattern of movement. With each season, they followed the land's natural cycles, arriving when resources were abundant and moving on when they were depleted. These changes in the environment also influenced social structures. The need to gather, process, and share diverse resources fostered new forms of cooperation and communal living. Foraging and fishing often required teamwork, and by working together, they could make the most of each environment. As they settled into a more seasonal way of life, they learned the value of community, of shared roles, and of planning ahead to make sure everyone had enough to eat. As humans adapted to these new ecosystems, some began to take an even more active role in managing their surroundings. They experimented with cultivating wild plants and controlling animal herds, laying the groundwork for the agricultural revolutions that would follow. By learning the cycles of plants, observing animal behavior, and testing the potential of different resources, they were setting the stage for one of humanity's most profound shifts, the move from gathering to growing. In the early days of the Holocene, our ancestors depended on a vast knowledge of their environment, gathering plants, hunting animals, and fishing to survive. But as climate stabilized and resources became more predictable, something remarkable began to happen. People started experimenting with ways to cultivate and control the food sources around them, transitioning from foraging to the first hints of food production. Wild grains, which had long been gathered for their seeds, became one of the first plants to be tended and harvested intentionally. By returning to patches of grasses and selectively picking the most fruitful plants, early humans may have noticed that certain types grew better than others. Over generations, they began to influence the growth of these grains by choosing those that were easiest to gather and produced the most seeds. Grinding stones became essential tools as people found ways to process and store wild grains, transforming them into a stable, versatile food source. This simple but powerful innovation allowed them to access the nutrients in seeds and grains more easily and enabled them to carry these foods through seasons when resources were scarce. At some point, people began actively protecting patches of plants, using stones and branches to guard them from animals or mark them for later use. This shift from passive gathering to active caretaking was one of the first steps toward a settled way of life. With each year, with each season, they came back to the same plants, taking what they needed but also shaping the environment to support future harvests. It wasn't just plants that were brought under human care. Early humans noticed that certain animals could be directed and contained. Goats, for example, were hardy and able to thrive in rugged landscapes. By managing their movements, protecting them from predators, and keeping them close to camp, people were beginning to tame animals for food, milk, and even companionship. These early attempts at herding marked a monumental step toward a controlled food supply. With each experiment, early humans were learning to cultivate life itself. By planting seeds, they could produce their own resources, moving beyond the limitations of seasonal gathering. This knowledge grew slowly, rooted in years of observation and trial. As humans transformed from passive foragers to active food producers, controlling their own sustenance in ways their ancestors had never imagined. With these new skills, they no longer had to travel constantly to find food. They could settle for longer, build temporary shelters, and start creating communities around the resources they cultivated. This stability changed the rhythm of life, setting the foundations for villages, family groups, and the beginnings of social cooperation. Food production offered a new security, one that allowed them to build a future rooted in the land itself. Across continents, each society transformed the plants and animals around them, selecting those that best suited their unique needs and environments. Through careful observation and experimentation, they created a patchwork of agricultural practices, each shaped by the land, the climate, and the traditions of its people. These early food systems would lay the groundwork for the rich agricultural diversity we see around the world today, each crop telling the story of a community's ingenuity, resilience, and connection to the land. In different parts of the world, as early humans began experimenting with agriculture, each region developed its own unique crops, methods, and adaptations that reflected the local climate, geography, and available resources. These regional practices laid the foundations of distinct agricultural traditions that would continue to evolve over millennia. In the Middle East, often called the cradle of civilization, fertile river valleys like those of the Tigris and Euphrates provided ideal conditions for early farming. Here, people domesticated wheat, barley, and lentils, crops that could withstand the arid climate and be stored for long periods. The predictable flooding of rivers enriched the soil, creating a natural irrigation system that allowed settlements to flourish along the banks. With each harvest, communities improved their techniques, gradually shifting from foraging to establishing stable, food-producing settlements. In Africa, food production emerged with incredible diversity. Unlike the centralized agricultural revolution of the Middle East, Africa's domestication practices were more varied and spread across vast regions. The Sahara, which was once a green and habitable land, supported early sorghum and millet cultivation. In the Ethiopian highlands, farmers domesticated crops like teff and coffee, while in West Africa, yams and oil palm became staples. African agriculture adapted to the continent's many climates, from tropical rainforests to savannas, reflecting a broad spectrum of regional knowledge and environmental management. In East Asia, rice became the focal crop. Along the Yangtze River basin, early farmers learned to cultivate rice in flooded paddies, using natural and constructed irrigation systems to regulate water levels. This innovation allowed rice to thrive in East Asia's humid and wet conditions, providing a reliable food source. Further north along the Yellow River, communities focused on millet, a hardy grain well-suited to drier and colder conditions. Together, rice and millet shaped the diets and social structures of ancient East Asian civilizations, giving rise to stable communities and complex societies. Mesoamerica, with its dense forests and challenging environment, saw the domestication of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. In the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico, ancient farmers developed ways to cultivate corn from its wild ancestor, teosinte, marking one of the most important agricultural innovations in history. Corn provided a reliable carbohydrate source, beans added protein and nitrogen to the soil, and squash helped retain moisture and reduce weed growth. This combination allowed for a balanced and sustainable diet, laying the foundation for thriving civilizations in the region. In the Andes of South America, agriculture adapted to the unique high-altitude conditions. Farmers terraced the mountainsides, creating flat plots that prevented soil erosion and retained water. Here, they cultivated potatoes, quinoa, and other native crops capable of withstanding the cooler, harsh mountain climates. Llamas and alpacas, domesticated for their meat, wool, and transport abilities, also became integral to Andean agricultural life. This combination of terrace farming and animal domestication sustained ancient Andean communities, allowing them to build complex societies in one of the world's most challenging terrains. Finally, in North America, indigenous peoples developed regional agricultural practices suited to diverse environments. Along the Mississippi River Valley, farmers cultivated corn, squash, and beans, adapting the Mesoamerican Three Sisters technique to local conditions. In the Southwest, they developed advanced irrigation systems to farm maize in arid landscapes, with some communities even constructing canals to draw water from distant rivers. In the eastern woodlands, people relied on native plants like sunflower, sumpweed, and goosefoot, which became essential sources of food and oil. These practices allowed North American societies to sustain large, stable communities and develop complex cultural traditions tied to their local ecosystems. Each of these regions, whether cultivating grains in fertile valleys, experimenting with hardy crops in savannas, or developing ingenious irrigation systems, showcases the remarkable adaptability and ingenuity of early humans. By shaping their surroundings, they created agricultural traditions that would form the foundation of future civilizations, adapting and refining methods that are still recognizable in the world's agricultural systems today. Over thousands of years, early humans transformed wild plants and animals into domesticated staples through the patient and deliberate process of agricultural innovation. They selected, bred, and cultivated certain species for desirable traits, shaping a food landscape that would sustain growing communities and lay the foundation for future civilizations. One of the earliest and most impactful agricultural innovations was selective breeding. By choosing seeds from plants with the best qualities, larger grains, sweeter fruits, or hardier stalks, ancient people began cultivating crops that differed significantly from their wild counterparts. Wheat and barley, for instance, were selected over generations to have larger seeds and non-shattering stalks, which meant the seeds remained on the plant until harvested, rather than dispersing naturally. These small, intentional choices had enormous consequences, as they made harvests more efficient and increased the reliability of each crop. Similarly, early farmers learned how to influence the growth of staple crops by creating favorable conditions for them. In ancient Egypt, farmers timed planting with the seasonal flooding of the Nile, which brought nutrient-rich silt to their fields, fertilizing the crops naturally. In the Americas, people burned sections of forest to clear land for farming, enriching the soil with ash and reducing competition from wild plants. These practices demonstrate how ancient communities developed techniques to maximize the productivity of the land, transforming ecosystems into cultivated, productive fields. Ancient people also practiced grafting and other propagation methods to create more reliable food sources. For instance, in the Near East and Mediterranean, they learned to graft branches of olive trees and grapevines, producing stronger, faster-growing plants. These techniques allowed farmers to create orchards and vineyards that would bear fruit consistently year after year, supporting larger populations and encouraging the growth of trade networks centered around surplus goods like olive oil and wine. The domestication of animals was another revolutionary innovation, changing human diets, transportation, and labor forever. In the Fertile Crescent, sheep and goats were among the first animals domesticated for meat, milk, and wool. These animals were easy to herd and could thrive in varied environments, providing a renewable source of protein, clothing, and other resources. Domesticated cattle, which followed, could pull plows and carts, expanding the scope of farming and enabling the cultivation of larger fields. In Asia, the domestication of horses opened new possibilities for travel, trade, and warfare, profoundly altering human societies. One of the most intricate and effective agricultural practices was intercropping, in which multiple crops were grown together to maximize soil nutrients and productivity. Indigenous farmers in Mesoamerica cultivated corn, beans, and squash together, creating a mutually supportive system. Corn provided a tall stalk for beans to climb, beans enriched the soil with nitrogen, and squash leaves spread low, shading the ground to retain moisture and reduce weeds. This technique not only improved yields but also promoted soil health, demonstrating an early understanding of ecological principles. Agricultural innovations also extended to storage and preservation techniques. In regions with unpredictable climates or long winters, people developed ways to store food surplus for leaner times. In the Andes, for instance, people developed freeze-drying methods for potatoes, creating chuno, a lightweight, long-lasting form of dried potatoes that could be stored for years. In Egypt, granaries were constructed to store surplus grain, allowing communities to withstand droughts and ensuring a stable food supply that supported the growth of complex societies. The ancient people's experimentation with irrigation transformed agriculture and allowed the expansion of farming into drier areas. Mesopotamians built extensive canal systems that channeled water from rivers to their fields, enabling year-round crop growth. In ancient China, farmers constructed terraces and developed intricate irrigation systems to control water in hilly or mountainous areas. These advancements turned challenging terrains into fertile land, showcasing humanity's early engineering prowess and its adaptability to diverse landscapes. Through these innovations, ancient people didn't just cultivate food. They fundamentally altered their relationship with the land, transforming it into a source of sustenance that could be managed, stored, and relied upon. These agricultural practices became the foundation upon which civilizations were built, each advance helping societies grow, specialize, and thrive. From selective breeding to irrigation, intercropping to preservation, every innovation reflected a deepening understanding of nature and the emerging power of humanity to shape its own destiny. As agriculture took hold across different regions, it triggered profound changes in human populations, a process known as the Neolithic Demographic Transition, NDT. With the advent of farming, communities had access to more reliable and abundant food sources, allowing populations to grow rapidly. Unlike hunting and gathering, which limited group sizes and required frequent movement, food production enabled people to settle in one place, support larger families, and establish permanent settlements. This stability marked the beginning of a transformation in human society and community structure. The transition to farming also reduced seasonal fluctuations in food availability, decreasing the risk of starvation. This newfound security allowed more children to survive infancy, and families could have more offspring to help with farming and livestock. Over generations, this led to exponential population growth, creating the first dense, structured communities. Archaeological evidence from early farming sites shows increased numbers of homes, storage facilities, and communal spaces, all built to support a growing population and a more cooperative social framework. But this demographic shift came with trade-offs. The higher population density brought new challenges, such as the spread of diseases that thrived in larger, settled groups. Living in close quarters with domesticated animals introduced pathogens previously unknown to humans, leading to outbreaks of illnesses that spread quickly. The transition also introduced pressures on natural resources. Larger communities required more land for farming, leading to deforestation, soil depletion, and a significant impact on local ecosystems. This rapid population increase led to the formation of new social hierarchies. As surpluses grew, certain individuals and families gained control over excess food supplies, creating distinctions in wealth and power that hadn't existed in smaller, egalitarian forager groups. Leaders emerged, tasked with managing resources, organizing labor, and protecting the community. The structure of society itself was shifting toward stratified social roles, emerging elites, and the beginnings of organized governance. Over time, this demographic shift fueled the expansion of villages into larger, more complex settlements. The early farming communities laid the groundwork for urban centers, trade networks, and cultural exchanges across regions. From these initial surges in population and complexity, the first cities began to emerge, marking the dawn of civilization as we know it. In conclusion, the Neolithic demographic transition was a turning point that redefined human society. The shift from foraging to farming didn't just feed more people. It reshaped social organization, introduced new health challenges, and set humanity on a course toward the development of complex societies. This transformation laid the foundations for the civilizations that would follow, marking a defining chapter in the story of human history. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. And do not forget, subscribe to the knowledge.